Welcome to this webinar run by the consortium that is working on the RECEIT project. RECEIT is an EU project that looks into remote climate effects and the impact on European sustainability policy and trade. It's funded by the EU Horizon 2020 program. My name is Reinhard Mechler. I'm at IIASA. I work at IIASA. I'm the moderator today, and I'm excited to welcome colleagues to talk about the local and remote risks to food security in low-income countries. We're excited to have Patryk Kubiczek of PIC speak up, followed by Sefa Marzi, ex-CMCC, now with the JRC, and then comments by Esther Boere of IIASA. Before introducing colleagues properly, let me say one or two words about the setting and the context of the project. As most people present in that meeting know, the RECEIT project studies impacts that happen outside of Europe and how are they affecting European finance, business, and policy and developmental strategies. So things happening outside of Europe, how would that affect Europe, and what can Europe do about this? In work package 5, we studied international developmental issues here. So it's really about humanitarian and development policy led by Europe to deal with impacts that happen outside of Europe. Mostly we focus on Africa. In that work package, we are currently well underway, and we are studying two kinds of issues. One is about locust infestations at the Horn of Africa over the last few years. We combine this with information about multi-breadbasket failures and trade restrictions that we have seen in the world food price crisis in 2007 and 2008. It's a one storyline, and the other storyline is about displacement induced by extreme coastal flooding in Mozambique. The RECEIT project indeed studies those storylines, so counterfactuals. How has stuff happened without climate change? What role did climate change play? And what can be done about this? I think Patryk will have much more to say and more intelligent comments to bring in. So let me directly now introduce the speakers that will give the presentations. So excited to have Patryk speak up. Patryk is a doctoral researcher in the group on event-based modeling of economic impacts of climate change. And he works in PICS, so the Potsdam Institute for Climate Change, domain 3 on transformation pathways. So something that's very relevant and salient, as we all know. His presentation will be complemented by a presentation by Sefa Marzi, who is a climate impact researcher, ex-staff of CMCC, so the Euro-Mediterranean Center for Climate Change in Venice, but now he joined the Joint Research Center in ISPRA, the European Joint Research Center in ISPRA. So Patryk will speak up, and Sefa, and then Esther Boere of my institution, IIASA, who is like an economist in the Integrated Biosphere Futures Research Group, will provide excellent comments that will lead us into a good discussion, I'm sure. So with that, without much more ado, let me just hand it over to Patryk, Sefa, and Esther, and we come back to comments and Q&A later on. So thanks, over to Patryk.
Thank you, Reinhard, for this excellent introduction. It's my pleasure to be here to speak about the work that we have done within our working package 5 of the RECEIT project, and more specifically of our team here at the PIC, which consists of me, Christian Otto, and Kilian Kula, who was helping us to do the research I will present today. So the outline of my talk looks following. I will start with providing a general introduction to climate change, impacts on stability dimension of food security. I will continue with presenting to you a storyline we have developed in which locust infestation in the Greater Horn of Africa is compounded with a global food price crisis. Then I will focus on the part on which I have directly worked on, namely a development of a new model to understand price and trade flow anomalies in the agricultural markets. I will finish with further research plans, and then I will let Sefa tell us about how he did a specific application of our storyline outcomes using informed severity index, which translates in principle our input as climate impact modelers into index which can inform humanitarian action. So I will start with food security. So food security is a situation when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. And it's important to distinguish here 4 dimensions of food security. Availability, which is about physical presence of food. However, availability does not guarantee food access, which is about households' physical and economic access to food. For example, if prices are too high for consumers, even if the food is available, they might have difficulty buying it. And also access itself does not guarantee that food utilization, meaning adequate nutrition and energy intake, will be guaranteed. The 4th dimension, which is related to this time dimension of food security, is stability. And we have a stability of food stability when the food availability, access and utilization are undisrupted. And it's especially important to note in context of climate change. So climate change already has direct impacts on the food system through increasing temperature, changing precipitation patterns, and higher frequency of extreme weather events. And exactly, I would like to focus on this 3rd aspect, the extreme weather events, since it has been argued that it poses a serious risk to the stability dimension of food security. For example, since the production of major staple crops is really concentrated in a few producing areas in the world, the risk of multiple breadbasket failures is becoming more and more important. And as also noted by the recent IPCC special report on climate change and land, because our food system is so interconnected also through trade, and because of this risk of events like multiple breadbasket failures, the food system and the food security, which is an outcome of the food system, is at the risk of disruption by climatic drivers. Which brings me to a concrete storyline, which I want to show you. So storyline is a methodology that has been extensively used in the RESET project. And for a storyline, we follow like several steps. The first step is to select hotspot and event that is the main part of the storyline. And in case of our food insecurity storyline, the hotspot is Greater Horn of Africa. And Greater Horn of Africa, already in the present climate and socioeconomic situation, is faced by high risk of food insecurity. So for example, last year, over 30 million people out of the total population of around 260 million were classified as being in a situation of food crisis or worse. And this food insecurity has been driven by economic downturn caused, among others, by COVID lockdown, disruption in the international markets, but also conflict and migration in the region is an important risk factor for those countries. Apart from these socioeconomic factors, also climate drivers play a role. This region is faced by often droughts or even extreme rainfalls. The weather patterns are very unstable in that region, which poses big challenges to agriculture. And also last year, this region witnessed a big locust infestation, which posed big risks to harvest. So the storyline consists of two parts. One, the factual part, which are the local production shortages of main staple crops of the year 2019 and until 2021, which were due to locust infestation. But we also consider a compounding event which in this case would be a global food price crisis, like the one that happened in 2007, 2008. So we just ask this hypothetical question: what would have happened if those two events coincided at the same time? So the storyline is not about attributing probabilities to certain events, but rather to consider a plausible scenario. And in this case, the plausibility established by the fact that those events actually happened. We just consider what would happen if both of them happened at the same time. So I will briefly report on the first local driver of food insecurity, the locust infestation. So media actually covered this crisis in the Africa and Arabian Peninsula and Southeast Asia. So I will remind you that the desert locust found perfect breeding conditions on the Arabian Peninsula, but also on both sides of Red Sea, due to unusual rainfall from tropical cyclones. And some studies have attributed this unusually high rainfall to the warm phase of the so-called Indian Ocean dipole. And there are also arguments that say that the warming of the Indian Ocean contributes to those rainfalls being bigger over time. And this creates these great breeding conditions for locusts, which are insects which can devour big parts of crop fields in a very short time. But it was not also this climatic driver. Also countermeasures that are usually done against locusts were delayed because of COVID pandemic. And this led to large swarms forming, creating a real threat to food security in the affected regions, as you see on the map, including a big part of Greater Horn of Africa. And Greater Horn of Africa is an important area for EU external policy. It's an important destination of the EU humanitarian aid and development funds. And also in case of this locust crisis, EU was the top donor of funds to curb the spread of the locust, safeguard livelihoods, and promote recovery. It was over 40 million euro or dollars from EU, but also from individual EU countries. So now I will move on to the second driver, the counterfactual driver, world food price crisis. So in 2007 and 2008, within a very short period of time, the prices of wheat and maize increased by 200%, price of rice increased by as much as 300%. The short-term drivers of this crisis were harvest failures in important crop exporting countries, which can be seen as a prototype of this multiple breadbasket failure that I mentioned. But also these harvest failures impacts were amplified by the response of exporting countries who imposed export restrictions, which caused panic on the market. And also, like, the reason for this panic were record low global stock to use ratio. So like the global reserves were record low in this period, as you can see on the lower graph. And why is this why was this world food price crisis important for Horn of Africa? Well, many African countries, well, most of them are highly dependent on imports of cereals, as you can see on this map, where I plot cereal import dependency ratio, which shows you whether countries are net exporters or importers of cereals. African countries are dependent on imports. And as you see on the right graph, the gray line is an FAO food price index, which is like a proxy for international prices of food. And here the change is plotted for those indices. And as you can see, like globally, this spike of FAO food price index caused like relatively small spike in consumer price indices. But specifically for the region of Eastern Africa, of which Great Horn of Africa is part of, this transmission of the global price to local consumer price was higher than average. And having given this description of the drivers, I will just move on to methods of our analysis. So we focused on three main staple crops: wheat, maize, rice. We look at production, domestic supply, trade, and reserves data from FAO Stat and United States Department of Agriculture PSD database. The metrics we use to assess scenarios are world market price, which we calculate according to a year-to-year global supply-demand model twist. And world market price could be a proxy for the food access dimension of food security. The second metric is impaired supply, which is a difference in supply between perturbed scenario and baseline state. And this is a metric related to the food availability dimension of food security. And we do this estimate based on a static network-based food shock cascade model. So the setup we consider is the following. We consider in total 3 scenarios: one factual scenario, which are 2009-2021 production anomalies, including those in low-cost affected countries. And we consider 2 counterfactual scenarios, where we put on top of the factual scenario the anomalies that happened in 2007, 2008. And the second counterfactual scenario is the same as the first one, where we consider factual scenario, harvest anomalies, but also the export restrictions, which actually, as I will show, played an important role. And again, we look at those 2 metrics that I mentioned. So the factual scenario, in the factual scenario, we focus only on African countries in the low-cost affected areas. And as you can see, the wheat production in Ethiopia and Kenya was lower than the baseline in the considered period. The same applies to rice, also for Tanzania, and also corn in Ethiopia. And according to our analysis, there is a risk of supply maybe not being high enough for those countries as a result of this production failure. But then let's consider the counterfactual scenarios. Here I show 2 graphs. On the left-hand side, we have a situation from the year 2007. On the right-hand side, we have a situation from the year 2008. And this illustrates these multiple breadbasket failures that I mentioned. For example, in year 2007, Canada, United States, EU, and Australia experienced a negative production anomaly of wheat, while in 2008, this negative production anomaly happened in Argentina. All of those countries are important wheat exporters. Regarding export restrictions, the circles, the size of circle denotes the share of global production of a given crop. And the black part of the circle is the share of production that was restricted from export. And for example, in 2008, India imposed an export ban on rice, which was considered to be the main driver of this very high increase of rice price. So this is like input to our modeling analysis, and here is the result. So we consider how the impaired supply changed with respect to factual scenario, if on top of it we consider these counterfactual scenarios. And on the left, we consider only harvest anomalies of the year 2007, 2008, while on the right, we consider harvest anomalies and export restrictions. So as you can see, if there are no export restrictions, countries which experience negative shock in production, their import supply is also negative. For example, Argentina in case of corn. However, when we consider the export restrictions, Argentina's import supply becomes positive. Why? Because of these export restrictions, which kept the produce domestically. However, it causes food insecurity risks to other import-dependent countries. And you see a majority of countries in Africa experience import supply due to export restrictions. So the bottom line is that export restrictions by a few main exporters are sufficient to jeopardize food security in import-dependent countries. But here's an important disclaimer that our analysis provides only a risk assessment, not prediction of food insecurity, since one could also consider higher order effects where, for example, import-dependent countries change their suppliers trying to mitigate the effect of export restrictions. Now I will show the results on prices. So the low-cost infestation itself did not have important impacts on the world market prices. However, if we consider scenarios with harvest anomalies only and export restrictions, we see a clear difference. So harvest anomalies, if those harvest anomalies of 2007-8 happened in the past 2 years, the price effect could be even negative. However, if export restrictions were followed by those anomalies in the major exporting countries, still the price hikes could be comparable to past crises for wheat and rice. And this is even though the global stock-to-use ratio nowadays is higher than the one in 2007-8. So one policy suggestion that one can draw from our analysis is that we need a two-pronged approach. We need a targeted support to most vulnerable consumers in low-income countries, such as countries of Greater Horn of Africa. But we also maybe need to support these middle-income exporters, such as Argentina and Ukraine, who might be facing internal instability due to different factors. Like, for example, Argentina now is experiencing a hyperinflation, and Ukraine is still politically unstable because of the low-intensity war going on in the eastern part of the country. So the message we want to convey is that better international collaboration could avoid uncoordinated unilateral policy responses such as export bans. And now, change of gears, I will move to the part I work directly on, which is the development of a new modeling framework for this kind of scenarios. So I showed you that we use two different modeling frameworks to estimate price and trade flow anomalies. While the goal of Agrimate, the new model, is to have a unified framework. And this is an agent-based network model where we want to simulate non-equilibrium economic dynamics in a way similar to Acclimate model, which is used in another working package of the RECEIT project. So our motivation is to be able to resolve food security impacts on at least monthly timescales. And the drivers of those impacts in our model are only exogenous production anomalies, short-term export restrictions, but we don't aim to really account for long-term trends as established agronomic models like Globiome or MAGPIE do. It's important for us to have this stock-keeping dynamics. As I said, the stock-to-use ratio is an important predictor also for food crisis. And again, the outcome of our model is to see plausible changes to food trade flows and prices in the aftermath of supply shocks. And here's an example of microdynamics of the model. So it's an agent-based model. We have producer agents, we have consumer agents, and here you see Russia as producer agent, which is driven by a time series of harvest, which is translated into local offer prices, producer prices, and also the model dynamics determines the exports that are done from this agent to others. And the consumer agent has a task to choose his suppliers out of a portfolio. And as you can see, this changes seasonally and also depending on production anomalies in supplying countries, which is then translated into local prices and consumption anomalies. And these are our preliminary results, since we are still working, especially on the consumer part of the model. However, we can already do some comparisons to aggregate quantities, such as world market prices. And as you can see, the gray line is the historical time series of prices. The blue one is the simulated one. And we can, to some extent, reproduce this price peak of 2007-8. We also account very well for the stock dynamics. So the stock variation that which would be the green line, to a big extent corresponds to the historical time series. And also, like, the final result of our model is also domestic supply anomaly, which can be interpreted as consumption anomaly. And in this case, the agreement is not so good yet. However, we are trying to understand this better and improve the consumer part of the model. And this brings me to the end of my talk, where I will just briefly say about further research plans. So first, we want to explore different export policies. So we want to answer the question, can moderate export restrictions reduce trade-related food security risks? I mean, is there a way for exporting countries to secure their domestic supply by introducing some mild export restrictions, but without driving world market prices too high? Also, we want to understand better the food security impacts during world food price crisis. For example, the world food price crisis of 2007-8 was early claimed to increase the undernourishment rate in Sub-Saharan Africa by 4%. However, after looking at populations, which are composed mostly of farmers, actually could have partially benefited from high prices. So this is a very complex issue. And when we look at the official time series of FAO for the region of Eastern Africa, it's hard to see, like, to attribute unambiguously increase of undernourishment rate to a single event like 2007-8 crisis. And obviously also we want to work on storylines while climate change plays a more direct role. And we would try to answer a question, how would severity of some event-based food insecurity storyline, where, for example, we have a local drought, would change in a warmer world. So I would like to thank you for listening to my part. I will be happy to answer questions later during the discussion, but now I will invite Sefer to talk about informed severity index in the context of this food security storyline.
Thank you very much, Patryk. So as Reinhard explained before, the objective of this package is to build a science policy interface to link our physical storylines to humanitarian and development action. So as a complementary analysis to Patryk's work and as a proof of concept for now, we have developed some micro storylines for food insecurity and hunger using informed severity index from Joint Research Center. So the informed severity index is a composite indicator that measures the severity of humanitarian crisis against a common scale. And the index communicate the current status of humanitarian crisis in a systematic, comparable, and objective way, and contributes to improved effectiveness and coordination in humanitarian action. The index was built upon the request of humanitarian organizations such as ACAPS, European Commission, FCDO, and OCHA. JRC is responsible for methodology, and ACAPS collects the data. So the index comprises three main pillars: impact of the crisis, condition of people affected, and complexity of the crisis. The first pillar, impact of the crisis, includes geographical and human factors, including area affected, people affected, displacement, and fatalities. The second column, condition of people affected, includes the information about the people in a crisis affected area, and their conditions are categorized from minimal to extreme. And finally, the complexity of the crisis pillar comprises the factors affecting the operational environment and how complex is to deliver humanitarian assistance. In total, it includes 42 indicators, standardized and aggregated to compute the final severity of the humanitarian crisis in different parts of the world. So as a case study, we chose Ethiopia, which is among top 20 hunger hotspots identified by FAO and WFP. We use the undernourishment indicator, which is among 2 indicators used for hunger by FAO. To develop our micro storylines, we add the undernourishment anomalies, around 4.7 million, regarding the 2007-2008 World Food Crisis, to recent crises in Ethiopia identified by Informed Severity Index, such as flood, international displacement, and conflict in Tigray. To have more micro storylines, we also add COVID-19 confirmed cases and deaths, and also the conditions of humanitarian assistance in the region. So we assume the condition that the humanitarian access is completely blocked. So here is the results for each crisis, current crisis in Ethiopia. As you can see, the first row of the graphs describes the current severity score of the crisis in the region, calculated by Informed Severity Index. And beneath, you can see the micro storylines for undernourishment, blocked humanitarian access, COVID-19, and also the combination of all factors. For the flood crisis in Ethiopia, 400,000 people were in need of humanitarian assistance. So by adding the undernourished population, the severity increases drastically. And finally, considering all factors and micro storylines, the severity increases dramatically, and it goes to the brink of changing the classification of severity. The same for international displacement in Ethiopia, which is a hotspot for migrants from South Sudan, Eritrea, and Somalia. So the combination of all micro storylines and factors increases drastically the severity. And finally, the Tigray conflict, which has the severity score is relatively higher than the other 2 crises. So by adding the undernourishment and other factors, the severity even increases more from the baseline, and it pushes the severity into brink of changing the class of severity. So such severity scores can be fed into humanitarian stakeholders and donors, screening, scanning, and analysis of financial requirements and allocation procedures as a complementary information. According to OCHA Financial Tracking Service, the humanitarian community targeted 7 million people for humanitarian assistance with a financial requirement of 1.2 billion, for which 57% is already covered and 42% is still unmet. So to cover the additional undernourished population and all other factors such as COVID and humanitarian assistance, the funding can increase significantly. The funds can be in the form of livestock, cash plus packages, and some services to vulnerable farmers. As you can see in the bar chart below, most of the funds were allocated to coordination, logistics, food and nutrition, and very few funds has been allocated to resilience and adaptive capacity factors such as education, water treatment, and health services. So if we want to build more resilient society to prevent more severe events in the future, we need even more funds to allocate to those factors in the future. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Esther. Over to Esther Boere of IIASA for some comments. Thanks, Esther and Patryk, for excellent presentations so far.
Yes, thanks a lot, both Patryk and Esther. So my name is Esther Boere. I will show you a few slides to reflect on the very nice presentation from Patryk mostly. So I think in general, the presentation has been very nice because it combines, it's unique in a certain way that it combines two drivers, an economic one through the food prices and a more climate-driven one through the local infestations. And this it is able to relate to the relation between export restrictions and food availability then. And in this, it is unique in the sense that it also combines these differences in terms of skills with food prices acting more at a macro level scale and local infestations acting more at a local scale. The second part in which I think it's very novel and very interesting to see is that compared to the more standard equilibrium-based approaches, this uses a non-equilibrium approach, and that's especially relevant when looking into food shocks and shocks where actually consumers and producers are not in an equilibrium state. So those are my two quick takeaways by which I'm very interested in the story. I wanted to here highlight a bit more into this spatial and temporal dimensions. So just to start off, I think indeed that this is very interesting also because of the region, as the African region and especially Sub-Saharan and Middle East and Northern Africa are indeed the regions that are most faced with severe hunger impacts from climate change. And here I'm only showing still the impacts from hunger based on the more gradual and slow onset climate change, and not even yet the extreme events such as local infestations. So in this climate aspects impact different crops through space and through time differently. So here you could see for the African continent using the new CMIP6 data that there are differences to be expected between corn, rice, soybean and wheat. And these differences are in fact especially strong when we are looking not just into the gradual change as is highlighted here in this figure, but more into also the annual variabilities. And as Patryk already highlighted, to look at this in a composite way, in an integrated way, is therefore very important, because the adaptations might not just play between countries, but also between crops. So especially extreme events that would hamper various crops at the same time would have a large impact on undernourishment compared to a specific shock on only one crop. Of course, there is, in this sense, a large uncertainty, although we expect that both precipitation and temperature, the impacts of climate on those two climatic variables will have a big influence on crop productivity. There is also a large impact of uncertainty here between what is estimated by, for example, climate models. And for this effect, I think it's especially interesting what Patryk has shown, because the local infestations go a bit beyond the classical approach of looking into climatic drivers on food productivity, but really hampering directly a crop and not through a crop cycle and growing degree days, for example. Then a bit more about the impacts on trade. There have been actually mixed messages on the impacts of trade on climate adaptation in Africa. So on the one hand, there have been studies that show that the import dependency increases the vulnerability to production variance in exporting countries. So this is also something that Patryk has shown, I think. And on the other hand, there's regional trade in Africa enhances the resilience to local production shocks, and international trade reduces the annual price variability. So agricultural trade may be an important adaptation mechanism, but one thing that I think could be still added to this study here is to link explicitly the intra and inter-annual international markets, so both within the countries as well as between different countries. And this is for the reason that without sort of this subnational dimension that goes within the countries, we might on the one hand overestimate the role of international trade. For example, because food prices in remote areas may not be easily mitigated through international trade, and because there could be, for example, congestion in the point of entry, which actually hampers international trade. On the other hand, it could also underestimate the role of international trade, because international trade in some cases may actually be more important than trade within the country, because it might, for example, in southern Mozambique, imports from maize from South Africa are easier to obtain than actually the imports from within the country in northern Mozambique are. I think this sort of like both within and between the countries could further provide further insight in both this producer and this consumer perspective. One thing that is especially also relevant in this study, I think, is the human dimension. As you use an agent-based model, you can explicitly model the supply and the demand side through the producers and the consumers. And I think this is also very important to take into account when we study undernourishment. For example, in Ethiopia, there are highly diversified farms, and whether they are in what type of agroecological zone and on what type of activities they focus will highly impact also where they, how hard they are hit by such infestations. Then, for example, in Globium, there has been, we recently modeled the impacts of the AFC FTA, and we could see that an intra-African trade would increase by 6-fold by 2030 if actually these export bans and import bans are relieved within the continent. However, at the same time, we would have to note that there is still a large momentum to be done for improving the yield gap and actually intensifying productivity, because at the moment the continent is still hard hit by local production constraints, and therefore by itself it could not relieve food insecurity issues on a large scale. And one thing of modeling this food insecurity, maybe an idea could here be to also model a certain self-sufficiency constraints for within the continent. And my very last message would be that maybe related to more to SAFER, is a very interesting new index that has been created. I think one way here is to look a bit also beyond undernourishment towards a more diversified dietary patterns. That's it for my side. Thanks very much for the very interesting presentation.
Thanks, thanks Esther, thanks Sefa, and thanks Patryk for giving a great presentation. We are running a bit later, but there was so much exciting insight already, and Esther started already like checking in on comments. I think Esther had a comment to Patryk and Sefa. Let me also quickly report what's happened in the chat. Maybe I can just read the cues or the comments out, if that's okay, given the time that we have. One comment was done by Ted Shepard of University of Reading. He's one of the masterminds, of course, behind the storylines on the Receipt project. His question was about export restrictions on rice in India and China, whether that makes a big difference. And then Christian Otto, who is working actually on this project with Patryk, suggested that indeed there is an issue here, how important that is for like a small market, which the market on rice is, and that he would work on that with the Acromat model. So Christian answered that question already, so maybe we can just leave that behind. Let me just read out loud quickly two more questions that came in. Domenico Bovienzo, hopefully that's pronounced correctly. Well, he had a comment, and also Christian responded to it, you see it, right? But he had a comment on this question that also Esther alluded to, like how to study the urban versus rural impacts at scale, to really think about these impacts, how they make a difference in cities versus the countryside. Christian answered to that, but maybe I can just pose it to colleagues as well. And then Arthur Essenfelder, who's also working in that project, had a question on basically, his question was like how to think about the compound and cascading risks, also within the financial sector. I'm just reading it out. His question is it possible, have you considered including the effects of compound and cascading risks in the informed risk framework? So that's a great question to Sefa also, if that's okay. Yeah, maybe over to you, Patryk, Sefa, and of course Esther also. And Christian is answering in the background, Christian Otto, but cannot speak up. I hope that's okay. Yeah, over to you, colleagues.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So like regarding the modeling of urban and rural food security, like I need to highlight it again, like our modeling approach is rather top down, like we focus on the global food system and trade flows between agents, which are, well, at the moment, countries or even like macro regions. So like it's at this moment, it's really hard to speak about impacts for particular household groups. However, what you see in the model, we have like this separate producer agent and consumer agent. And that maybe needs some improvement, since like producers, small producers in Africa, they are also at the same time consumers. And as I said, like they might benefit actually from high prices. So I think like based on all the outputs of our model, it could in principle be able to capture this effect of this extra revenues going to producers, somehow mitigating this impact of high prices. So that would be my answer to the first question. about compounding events, like in principle, yes, that's also why we are developing this new agreement model, which is a non-equilibrium model, which in my opinion is better suited to answer questions about compounding events, like when the system doesn't really have time to equilibrate. But regarding how it could be used for the inform index, I will just give this question to Zephyr.
Sure. Thank you, Patryk. Actually, in the context of informed severity index, in order to capture compound and cascading crisis, they have already introduced a type of crisis named complex crisis. So they just capture they collect the numbers of all the crises happening in a geographical unit, in a country or in a region. And they have also regional crisis. And they put them all together to introduce the severity of that complex crisis, which includes compound and cascading crisis. So it's already there.
Thanks, Zephyr. Excellent. Maybe we have a little bit of time left, and there's questions coming in. Yeah, and colleagues, please consider posting more. Don't be shy. And I think it's coming in. There's Margarita Sacinella has a question on like combining national and subnational food insecurity figures. I think that's a great question to Patryk and maybe to Esther as well. I think Esther also went a little bit around that, regional, national, local, if I can put you up. And yeah, maybe this is one question. And then Hannah Kneppen, who is with our sister project, sister or brother, maybe it's sister project, Cascades, and she's with the ECDPM. Her question is a little bit on the policy side of things. So how far will we go in the project with developing concrete policy recommendations? So maybe quick answer from Patryk could be useful here. Like what's expected, maybe Zephyr as well. Zephyr will stay involved in the project. Over to you, colleagues, again, thanks.
So I will just quickly answer regarding subnational figures. So like our modeling framework is meant to mostly understand the risks at the national level, and obviously how it translates into subnational figures is like another question, and that's something we definitely want to work on, but I cannot really tell more about it. But I think Esther could, like, her ideas were very interesting and important, how it could be done, how the progress here could be made.
Yeah, thanks. I think it depends, of course, on the modeling framework. I saw that Christian already answered maybe a bit of a similar question towards maybe distinguishing different consumer groups within the model. Personally, I model a bit more on a gridded level. So then we would try to really represent the producers and on a spatial level. So, and then thereby this try to afterwards scale up. I think one way to do it here could indeed be to focus on different types of producers and consumers, and those, for example, on the producer side could be limited or within certain agroecological zones that are very much impacted by climate change, or certain farm types, as well as, for example, their access to markets, and whether they are more in living in urban or rural environments. And I think then it was back to you, Patryk, maybe for the other question.
About the policy implication. Yeah, I have to say that at the end, the policy implication would be how much people are in need of humanitarian assistance. And this number should be somehow defined by the modelers, how the climatic variabilities can be translated into the figures of food insecurity, severe and moderate food insecurity, and then how much humanitarian assistance would be needed to ease the situation. And with this informed severity, qualitatively, we can see how much the crisis would be mitigated or increased, and then this would be a screening information for the policymakers for the first phase of allocating the funds.
Mm-hmm. Great.
Yeah, like regarding policy implications, like the work I was presenting was mostly focused on analyzing like impacts, and our working package also has experts on the policy making side, and this work will be done in future to provide more detailed policy recommendations for the EU.
Yeah, this will be a next step in the project, working towards really concrete policy recommendations. And I really like this two-pronged approach that you mentioned in the beginning, Patryk. That's it's very exciting. We are now at 12 o'clock CET here. But let me still put a quick question into the mix by Ted again. So can you also look into different rural wealth groups? Would there be information at scale to also break it down according to wealth for those most impacted in rural regions? So probably a question to Patryk and Sef. Yeah.
I mean, this if the goal is really to understand the subnational figures on food security, like also the disaggregation on income groups, like one thing one could do like is to create like a several consumer agents, each of them representing like a different wealth group, like with different response of price of their consumption to prices. But obviously this increases the complexity of modeling, and then the question is also how complex do we want to make the model, since like then we have to account for more and more factors which are intertwined with all this food security question. And so at the moment it was not in our most direct follow-up steps, but in principle this can be done. But also another issue is like data availability, like especially for many African countries, data quality is not as good as we would wish for. So at the end, we also don't want to make this model be too much dependent on some extra assumptions we make.
Thanks, Patryk. Yeah, it's a good question, and good food for thought for further work. So there's two more questions coming in. Oh, okay. Let's if people are still interested on staying on TED again. Yeah, TED, great, many comments. Let me see here. I think Ted suggested to go a little bit backwards. It's more like a comment, go back a little bit into understanding what happened in the past with Indian monsoon, crop failures, in the 19th century even, to go back quite a while. And he posted a little reference, so that's exciting, that's great. Else I would say, we addressed all the questions, you see it, answered. And then it's also thanks to Christian Otto, whom you see also like here in the mix. Christian is like in the background, back office, attending to those comments. And thanks, Christian, who's coordinating the work at PIC and works closely with Patryk and Sefa. So thanks, Christian, for taking action and really that. I won't bring you in because I guess we are running over, but it's good to see your face. I hope that's great. With that, let me check again. Yeah, I would say, yeah, I would suggest we wrap it up. Thanks again to Patryk, then Sefa and Esther, and also Christian in the background. So that was really an exciting and thought-stimulating presentation. And again, that's for the receipt project. We are like in the midst of it, I would say. There's much more coming, and I think it's ever more relevant because indeed climate change is leading to impacts across the globe, and importantly also in Africa. The European Union, as I evidenced last week at Glasgow, as I saw at Glasgow, plays a key role in mitigation actions in Europe, but we also need to support mitigation and adaptation and loss and damage actions outside of Europe. So I think we got a great opportunity and role to play in shaping policies that can help to support the most vulnerable that are already being impacted by climate change. So with that, thanks again. That was exciting, and the video will be online forever. So that's great to see, and I hope your colleagues that were online also please hand it on or send it on to other colleagues. So I think that's important work, and please be in touch. You can find emails and addresses and can connect with us. I guess it's online, and hope to be in touch with all. And thanks again to the presenters, commentators, and the back office by Christian. And Elena for running, Elena at CMCC for running that technically. Thanks a lot, and be in touch.